David and Goliath. It's a familiar biblical story about how the powerless little guy wages war against a big bad 600-pound gorilla and improbably wins. And it's a way environmentalists like to portray themselves in their perennial battle against industry, little bands of underfunded underdogs who dare to take on the well-moneyed big business interests out to exploit Mother Nature. But the environmental movement is no David. Since its humble Earth Day beginnings, environmentalism has become a big business, whether measured number of organizations, number of members, or total revenues. I'm Joe Hicks. This is a PJTV Special Report. We teamed up with the Washington Examiner to bring you a series of special reports that take a look at Big Green, its size and agenda, the growth of its power and influence, and who stands to win and lose under its regulatory economics. What we learned disturbed us. Today, how big is Big Green? What does it want, and where is it trying to take us?
There are, thousands upon thousands of environmental groups right now, and they've been growing for decades.
I looked at all the laws that have been passed in Congress for the last 30 years, starting with the birth of the environmental movement. And I discovered that environmental regulation was number one. It was the fastest growing over those 30 years and the most expansive. So it is no wonder it has the biggest impact on our economy. It is a huge area, and they have managed to pass, major legislation throughout the decades.
In terms of dollars, the big story in the environmental movement is that the amount of money being spent on environmental causes has, basically quadrupled from the late 80s till about 2005, when it went from 1.9 billion to $8.2 billion a year being spent.
A surprising number of people still don't see that. They still think that organizations like the Audubon Society only want to have, pretty birds around for people to look at, or the National Wildlife Federation, cares about wildlife. They don't realize what these people really care about is reducing the human population, reducing private land ownership, and putting more and more land under federal ownership and federal control.
If you just take one environmental group as an example, the Natural Resources Defense Council, I think their budget is somewhere around $125 million a year. That's just one group. That figure is larger than the total budgets of the Heritage Foundation, AEI, the Cato Institute, and the Hoover Institution put together. And those are organizations that work on a broad range of issues, not just on the environment. Here at AEI, we have 3 or 4 people at most that work on the environment, whereas the NRDC has several hundred. And it's sort of amazing to me. This is sort of a David and Goliath business. The environmental movement is Goliath politically.
Last year alone, the total revenue for environmental and conservation groups was over $8 billion, up 400% over the previous 3 years. And a lot of that money is used for lobbying. What's Big Green lobbying for? Where do environmentalists want to take us?
The environmental movement has, I think, at least 2 priorities that are only loosely connected with a better environment. One is they believe in centralized power in Washington, D.C. There's lots of areas where you can point out that states and local governments would do a better job of solving environmental problems or dealing with environmental problems. The national organizations always oppose it because they want power centralized in Washington on the old theory that they like one-stop shopping.
It's not just about global warming. I mean, you realize that global warming, what that comes down to is, command and control over the entire economy.
The most important cause is the cause to American property owners, to our small businesses, to the people that are working in timber industries and farmers. But they have been hit very hard with regulations, not because there's an endangered species that they're harming, but because there's some habitat that might affect a species.
Private landowners, if you own something, you have very strong personal incentives to take care of it. I mean, owners are usually the best stewards of the land or best stewards of the resources.
What is the central organizing feature of freedom in the United States? And well, it's largely the freedom to go out and earn your own living, free from harassment by the government. Now, we've been chipping away at that steadily for a long, long time. But if you come in and you regulate carbon emissions, I mean, that is just, just throw in the towel. I mean, we might as well be communists at that point.
One of the long-term goals of the environmental movement that they don't often like to admit, but occasionally will write down somewhere in black and white, is they would like to see more global governance of the environment. Gus Speth, who teaches at Yale and worked for Jimmy Carter back in the 70s, has written openly that he'd like to see a world environmental organization that has power like the World Trade Organization to manage resource flows, ideally even population policies all around the world. So there really is this enthusiasm for global governance, for global problems. And of course, that kind of government is not accountable to voters. It's not democratic. It can be very bureaucratic and authoritarian, and they have no problem with that.
We had environmental groups that all teamed up to party a lawsuit to force the Environmental Protection Agency to regulate carbon emissions as if they were a pollutant. Carbon dioxide is produced by plants. It's not a harmful pollutant. And then all of a sudden, the EPA is threatening to regulate, carbon emissions. Well, when you threaten to regulate carbon emissions, what you're really threatening is to control the entire economy of the United States of America. Now, who thinks unelected bureaucrats at the Environmental Protection Agency were meant to control the United States economy?
Even when you have a problem largely solved, like air pollution, which is much, much lower than it was 30, 40 years ago, they still want to extend more regulatory control over business and industry, over energy use and so forth, because that allows them really to have a proxy control on the wider economy.
What's happening is the Obama administration is using the threat of the EPA regulating carbon emissions to try and force Congress to pass some liberal cap and trade scheme so that they get the agenda done in a way that is more legitimate. But there really is no legitimate way to say we're going to come in and control the entire economy based on carbon emissions. I mean, it's almost a completely arbitrary and severely economically damaging plan.
The fastest growing area of federal regulation? The environment. Federal spending on environmental issues has increased over 7,000% between 1960 and 2006. Return the favor, a dozen top big green groups like the Audubon Society and Friends of the Earth have contributed over $14.5 million to political candidates in the last few years, and 96% of it went to one particular party.
The environmental movement seems to have decided many years ago to throw in its lot wholly with the Democratic Party. So today the environmental movement is to the Democratic Party what the National Rifle Association is to the Republican Party.
They're actually very cozy. A lot of the posts the Obama administration has filled have come from the environmental movement, top leaders there. There's a woman named Jane Lubachenko she's the head of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, which is the federal agency that basically, among other things, manages our oceans. Lubachenko, while she was in the Environmental Defense Fund, worked on this policy known as catch shares, which is think of it as like cap and trade, but for fishing. She's now head of NOAA, and she's implemented this catch shares policy that she developed while she was in the Environmental Defense Fund, and it's devastated the commercial fishing industry up and down the eastern seaboard.
The environmental movement has instead organized a lobby for big government control of different parts of our economy, and they believe that is the way to go. And because they have this appealing message, they've been able to raise a lot of money, signal a lot of alarm bells, and they have grown leaps and bounds since the 70s and have had a tremendous impact on our legal system and our economy.
You started finding environmental leaders saying man's a cancer on the planet, man's a plague on the planet, and so on. Mankind must be removed, or we must reduce human populations to a fraction of what they are now. Those days they were talking about perhaps moving the population back from 5 billion people to 1 billion people, and some want even more.
Environmental organizations, especially the Sierra Club and the NRDC, specialize in bringing lawsuits where they're often awarded legal fees. This is often done in a way that the accounting is hard to follow. Other groups get a lot of government research contracts, and those are also hard to follow from their accounting statements. Most of their funding is from private sources, from rich individuals and direct mail, but definitely if you cut off their government funding, they would notice.
Most Americans support conservation efforts. They're a little more iffy about environmentalism, whatever that means. So they want to preserve land so that we can use and benefit them, in terms of, conservation. I'm not so sure they want to, oppose population growth and, lock away, huge tracts of land from, resource development like the environmental movement does.
If you want to have a good example of the environmental movement's partisanship, think about the first President Bush for a moment. The first President Bush pushed very hard for a new Clean Air Act in 1990 and worked in a bipartisan way with members on both sides of the aisle in Congress to pass a very tough bill. He went to the Rio Earth Summit in 1992 and committed the United States to the UN climate framework that brought us the Kyoto Protocol. and also the UN Convention on Biodiversity to work on that other global problem. And so you'd think environmentalists would be pleased with the first President Bush. But when he ran for re-election, the number of environmental groups that endorsed Bush for re-election was 0.
President Obama was by far the biggest recipient of environmental political contributions, with a total of more than $2.4 million during the 2008 campaign. His biggest support came from the Sierra Club and Defenders of Wildlife, who each kicked in just under $1 million apiece. In the next part of our series, we'll take a look at green politics. How did the environmental movement grow so powerful? And what does all that money and power buy in Washington, D.C.? Look for Big Green here this week on PJTV. Hey, thanks for watching. I'm Joe Hicks.